topic's going to be the primary topic's the Brown Act, but I was also asked to cover a couple issues on the Public Records Act. There we go. And I think as a starting point for people to think about is both of those statutes serve essentially the same purpose, right? They're both openness and transparency statutes. They just get about it at a different way, right? So we're going to mostly go through the Brown Act, and then I will provide some information on the Public Records Act when the relevant slide comes up. So what is the Brown Act? It is essentially California's open meeting law that applies to local agencies. There is a different open meeting law that applies to state agencies. This one is the law that applies to school districts, right? And it's contained in the government code. It's called the Brown Act because that's what everybody knows it as, but the statutes themselves are situated in the government code. It is a sunshine statute. It's a transparency statute. It requires that agencies subject to that statute take their actions in public. So who does it apply to? As I said, it applies to legislative bodies and local agencies. It also applies to committees of local agencies if they're appointed by the board, right? So there's a special rule sometimes in the education code for school districts. One of those special rules applies to school districts in particular for some of your committees at the school site level. Oftentimes that's a question we get, is my parent advisory committee subject to the Brown Act? The answer is no, right? And there's a statute that lists off the committees in the Ed Code that are not subject to it. So I'll try to point out the special rules for schools as I go. Board members have to remember, as soon as you are an official candidate, if you are the successful candidate even prior to your taking office, you are subject to the Brown Act. So what is the basic requirement? The basic requirement is it requires a local agency to do its business in public unless there's an exception that says you don't have to. That would generally include deliberation and the taking of information that you received prior to making your decision. There's also a notice element to the Brown Act, which is what the agenda is for. So in the notice element, that's basically when you are putting out officially to the public and your community, here's what we're going to talk about, right? And they've been slowly modifying the Brown Act for coming into the 21st century. So school districts now, if you have a website, you're supposed to post your agenda on your website. One of the questions I get a lot is posting the agenda on the website alone enough to satisfy my posting requirement? That answer still right now is no, because there are too many people without access to the internet, right? So one of the core concepts is what actually is a meeting? When is it that you have to do it in public, right? And there are some handouts. You don't have to video the screen if you want just to get a handout. So the Brown Act will apply, the meeting requirements of the Brown Act will apply when you have a quorum, a majority of the board in the same place or by telephone, and they're going to be talking about or considering district business. And that's an important concept, and we're going to cover that in a little bit. It doesn't matter, actually, whether they're taking action. You can still have a meeting even if no action is taken. And so one of the things that we try to get across is the concept of a serial meeting, and that there's two analogies I'll use on that. One is what's known as a chain meeting, and the other one is a hub and spoke. So a chain meeting is where person A on the board emails person B about an issue that's part of the school district's business. Person B on the board then emails person C on the board about a subject that's part of the district's business. If you have a 5-member board and 3 board members are emailing back and forth about that, that can be a serial meeting out if you didn't do it with a published agenda. That's a chain meeting where it's going A to B to C. A hub and spoke meeting is where you have a central person as an intermediary and the communications go through that person, but all the communications are done for the purpose of forming a consensus on an issue of district business. Both of those should be avoided. The safe way, a lot of times what comes up is board members are just asking for stuff. They want to know, information from staff or they want to know information from the superintendent. So a safe way to do that is to use your information section of your agenda, because if you put it on the agenda as an information item, then you can talk about it all you want at the board meeting. It's usually pretty efficient for a different reason. If you ask staff something and you tell them that you need the answer ready by the next board meeting, you'll get the most efficient answer because they'll have time to get you the right answer. If you ask them the question at the meeting, then they may not have had the time to formulate the correct answer, and then they may have to wait till the next meeting. So what is not a meeting? Individual contact. If a member of the public contacts an elected official and they want to know something from you, individual contact does not constitute a meeting. Public conferences, perfect example here is CSBA every year, California School Boards Association. Just going to that does not make a meeting, even if a quorum of the board goes. Other local agency meetings, perfect example of that would be Salinas City. If 2 or 3 of this board went to a Salinas City council meeting, just the fact that you're there does not make it a school board meeting. Social gatherings, a wedding, right? You could have 3 or even 5 members of the board go to a wedding as a social function. It doesn't make it a meeting. One recommendation I would give you, sort of a practice tip, is don't sit together. Right? Because what happens is, even if you're religiously following the rules and you're not talking about anything that has to do with the school, other people don't know what you're talking about. So they'll see 5 of you sitting at a table together at a city council meeting or at a wedding, and the assumption will be, oh, you're talking about district business and this is not an agendized meeting, right? So when people are doing that, I usually recommend they don't sit together. What are the kinds of meetings you can have? Regular, special, and emergency. And we're going to go through each one of these here in a second. Regular meetings are your most formal meetings. These are the meetings, the schedule for which you set, and your annual organizational meeting, which you do in December. Okay? So when you have your December meeting, you set your schedule for your regular meetings, usually for the whole year. Some districts, you can change your regular meeting schedule in the middle of the year if you want. Some districts will do that when they go from, say, 1 meeting a month to 2 regular meetings a month. You can have added regular meetings. And one of the big distinctions for a regular meeting is you have to have your agenda out 72 hours in advance. Special meetings, these are called by either the board president or a majority of the board. These are not pre-noticed meetings. Sorry, that's what. Pardon me. Sorry, everyone. So one of the requirements for special meetings actually comes from the Education Code and not from the Brown Act. And that's a requirement for the delivery of the call of the meeting, the written notice. This is actually, it's a concept that comes out of corporate law. And when you set your regular meeting schedule, because the board members are involved in setting that schedule, the assumption is every board member knows when those meetings are. They voted on them, right? But you did not vote on special meetings because you don't know when they're happening until sometimes 24 or 48 hours in advance. So the notice provision for special meetings is to make sure that board members know the meeting's happening so they can come and vote. Otherwise, you could arrange meetings where you only pick the board members who show up, right? So that's why there's a written notice requirement. Typically, the agenda is the written notice, and it's delivered to board members a little bit before the 24-hour requirement. The written notice requirement can be waived by board members, and the statute provides that if the board member actually shows up at the meeting, even if they didn't get the notice, that dispenses with the notice requirement. Because the point of the notice is so they can show up and vote. So if they showed up for the meeting, if they're there at the time the meeting convenes, then the Education Code section provides that you can dispense with the notice requirement. It's kind of a common sense rule. One of the big differences between a special meeting and a regular meeting is that special meetings can be called on 24 hours notice. So one of the things about special meetings the point of those is to be dealing with a piece of business that generally can't wait for the next regular meeting, or sometimes districts will use special meetings to deal with a piece of business that's going to take too long to have at a regular meeting. You might need 3 hours on a particular item only. So sometimes a special meeting is an efficient way to do that, right? So the notice includes the time, the place, and you identify the business that will be transacted. That's the regular agenda description language. You do not have to have any comment on items that are not on the agenda for a special meeting. That's one of the differences. And the intent behind that is that you can just do the business that you said you need to do and not have to deal with stuff that's not on your agenda. Also, for special meetings, you cannot consider anything that's not on the agenda if you don't have the ability to do the after acquired piece, which I'll explain in a minute. Emergency meetings, the standard is pretty high for this, and they are pretty rare. Probably your most current example right now is the earthquake up in the Napa Valley area, or Sonoma. You know, if you have an earthquake tonight and you need to have a meeting tomorrow morning in order to talk about can you open your schools, right? That's probably going to qualify. But you know, the standard talks about disruption or threatened disruption of public facilities and services. That's not convenience. They're talking about a pretty serious event. In the almost 15 years I've been doing this, I still haven't had a client really do an emergency meeting. Teleconference. This actually is something that can be very useful for board members if they want to attend a meeting and vote on a meeting, but they have a scheduling conflict and they need to be somewhere else. And that oftentimes happens with board members that have to travel for work. You might have to be in San Jose or Burlingame or something. So long as you can meet the Brown Act requirements for a telephonic meeting, that board member can call in and participate in the telephonic meeting. Yes?
Question on that one. That has to be posted, doesn't it, on the website?
Yes.
Somewhere.
The biggest limit for that is you need to know ahead of time, because you have to post on the agenda the address for the telephonic location. The telephonic location needs to be accessible to the public, right? And you need to post the agenda at the telephonic location. So usually this works in the case of hotels. You can't do the telephonic participation from your car while you're going down 280 at 60 miles an hour. That's not going to work, right?
The windshield.
Yeah. But because it's obviously not accessible to the public, that's the problem. But if you know you're going to be in a hotel in San Francisco, right, if you can coordinate with the hotel to publish the agenda ahead of time at the hotel, and my tip, my practice point is don't do the call from your room, right? Because the public has to be able to attend the meeting from the telephonic location. So you coordinate with the hotel to get a little conference room. Anybody who wants to come, the conference rooms are always ADA accessible, which is a requirement, right? And you just put the phone in the middle of the table in the conference room. You have the address published on the agenda, and you can do the teleconference from there. And I should say, if the board has questions while I'm going through this, it's probably most efficient if you ask the questions while we're on the topic instead of after I move through it, because it's in everybody's mind at that point. So how do you conduct a meeting once you now have the obligation to do it in public? Right, this is always a question that comes up. So it is the board's meeting, and you have to get your business done. You just have to do everything you do in public unless there is a statutory exception that allows you to do it in closed session. So that the ways you get your business done are you control your agenda, you control your time limits for participation, and then you also control the scheduling of your meetings. Are you going to run it until late, or are you going to put it over, or are you going to do it over 2 meetings? Those kind of issues. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these. So what is the agenda? The requirement is that you have to briefly describe so that anybody reading it has a fair understanding of what it is you're going to talk about or do. Because people from the public who read your agenda, they'll look at that to decide, do they even want to go to your meeting, right? The Brown Act has a provision that lets the media or interested parties sign up on an annual basis, and they can request special notice of your agendas. And if they do that, you can charge a fee for mailing, and then you have to send them the agenda. And usually the media are the only ones that do this. And then they look at it to see, is there an item on there they want to cover? So you have to fairly describe what you're going to be talking about or what you're going to be doing. The statute talks about generally 20 words or less. You don't need 2 paragraphs of description. So then over control of the agenda, one of the questions is, who prepares it and who controls what it's going to say? Most districts, the majority of districts I would say, it's the board president and the superintendent who get together and they lay out the agenda and then publish the agenda. That's, I would say, by far the highest percentage of districts how they do it. Some districts, usually larger districts, will include a second board member, either one of the officers, or depending on how your board is, if the board has sort of camps that it's broken down into, maybe someone from what they would call the opposition, so that there's a transparency in how the agenda is being set, right? But the law doesn't set that. That's a matter for local board control. One of the things you have to decide when you're putting your agenda together is this going to be an action item or an information item? If it's an action item, do you want it on consent or not? And how much time do you want to put into the individual item? Some school districts or cities will put time estimates next to something. You know, this piece is estimated to take an hour, this piece is estimated to take 20 minutes. Not everybody does that. It's not required. So the next question we usually get is, well, what is the consent agenda? And what qualifies to be on it? The law doesn't actually control that. That's a matter that's left to the discretion of the local agency. Most agencies have a bylaw that talks about that. I think yours is 9322. So the consent agenda is still part of your regular agenda. It's just a subset. And it's designed to be a tool of efficiency. The point is you can have a bunch of non-controversial items that the board can take action on in one vote, one fell swoop. I think for your bylaw, you define them as items of a routine nature, or items where you're not anticipating discussion and where the superintendent recommends approval of the item.
I have a question for that one.
Yeah.
If it is a controversial issue, how do you recommend it?
Well, I wouldn't put it on consent, because if it's on consent, there's no way for you to deal with that item separately from the rest. And so you have to pull it for separate vote. So if you know it's going to get pulled for separate vote, you might as well not put it on consent. Right? So
you recommend that we vote on everything but the separate vote ones first? What's the sequence?
okay, so let me skip forward one. All right. What do you do when you have an item on the consent agenda and somebody wants to pull it? All right. Again, the law doesn't dictate this result, but what it does is it says that this is a board issue, right? So who can pull a consent item? That's a board question. So if a board member wants to pull a consent item, I believe your bylaw says any board member can, right? Normally, when the superintendent and the president are putting the agenda together, if they think an item's controversial, they won't put it on consent, because it's just going to get pulled anyway, right? But it's a board prerogative to pull items. It's not a member of the public's prerogative, and it's not a staff prerogative, because it's your meeting. It's you, the board. It's your meeting, right? So when the agenda comes out, what will oftentimes happen is if something is a hot item, people will email you, and they will start saying, hey, item 13B is really important to me. It shouldn't be on consent. And that gives board members the opportunity to make a decision within your discretion whether or not you want to pull it. And some districts will pull for separate discussion. And some allow that process only, and some say, no, if you pull it, it's for separate vote all the way. So I'll give you an example. Sometimes there will be a question about a particular consent item because a board member doesn't understand why something's happening. You just don't know. You might totally support it, but you need to get your question answered. So if you have a process that allows a board member to pull for discussion, when the consent agenda is being called, normally the president says, does anybody have any items to pull? You would raise your hand and say, I'd like to pull 10C for separate discussion, right? You ask your question, somebody answers your question. If it's answered to your satisfaction, it stays on the consent agenda, it gets voted on with everything else. If it doesn't, you pull it for separate vote. Not all districts do that, but it's a process you can do. So another question that comes up on efficiency of meetings and what you have to do is who can put items on your agenda besides the president and the superintendent? Well, of course, board members can ask that items be put on the agenda, right? But the education code requires that the public also have an opportunity to add items to your agenda. Now, this is one of those situations where the code just says you have to give the opportunity. It does not tell you how to do it. It says the board may adopt rules and regulations controlling the process to put an item on the agenda. And there's supposed to be a balancing act between how efficiently you can run your meeting and the importance of the item that's being requested. But the law doesn't tell you exactly how you get it there. It's up to your local policy. I think that if I got this from the most updated bylaw that you have, yours requires 1 week notice in advance in writing. But the next question that comes up is, well, what if the item they want to add has absolutely nothing to do with school business? And believe it or not, we get that. So questions come up about foreign policy. Somebody wants to put on an item on the agenda to talk about President Obama's policy in the Middle East. You guys really have no jurisdiction over that. So the case law says you have the ability to reject that item and not put it on the agenda. And the reason for that is since you have no jurisdiction to do anything about it, you don't have to waste your time addressing it. So the case I cited up here actually was a case against San Jose Unified. It's a decent example. In that case, there was a student club on campus. It was a middle school, and the student club was the Gay Straight Alliance. The student club wanted to hold a Rainbow Day, which focused on preventing bullying. And the parent, who was the plaintiff in this case, Moody, objected to that, and she wanted to add an item to the board agenda to have the board require that it be called a Global Anti-Bullying Day, not Rainbow Day, right? The school district denied that request, so Ms. Mooney sued for a petition for writ of mandate is what it's called. And the court said, no, you don't have to put it on the agenda. The board typically doesn't control what happens at individual school sites, so it's not within your jurisdiction. And it was a student club. It was not a district staff person doing it. Right? So that's a more concrete to a school example. Also, a practice pointer here, a little tip. The ability to add something to an agenda only applies to regular meetings. That does not apply, the law does not require you to allow that for special meetings. You can if you want, you can go above and beyond. But just in terms of what the law requires, it only requires that process for regular meetings.
Excuse me, who decides if it's open later or not? After the letter's received?
Yeah, ultimately the board decides that if there's a question about it.
The entire board?
Well, normally it's going to be the superintendent and the president, but if there's a question about it, I would recommend that it go to the board because ultimately you want a quorum to back that decision up. All right, so now we're going to move into the issue of, all right, it's already on the agenda. It's clearly been posted. It's out there. Who has the right to talk about what's already on the agenda? Right? So again, here the education code has specific requirements for this. At regular meetings, the public has to have the opportunity to directly address the board regarding any item of interest that's within your subject matter jurisdiction. And that's including items that are not on your agenda. Okay. So oftentimes this gets used for parents that want to bring an issue to your attention that's happening at their school, but it's not on your agenda. And so most districts have a policy on this. You put it at a particular time in your meeting, and you need to do that for regular meetings. You do not legally have to do that for special meetings. So can the board act on items that are not on the agenda? What if something comes to your attention, the agenda is already posted, and this item's not there, right? Again, the emergency situation does exist. You need to have a pretty good emergency. Subsequent need items, this is the one that probably comes up the most, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. Held over items are items that were on an agenda from a prior meeting, and you just, for whatever reason, ran out of time at that meeting, or somebody didn't show up who was supposed to be addressing that item, so the board has continued that item to the next meeting. The idea being it was already on the agenda and everybody at that meeting got notice it was being held over. And then the fourth piece here, which is announcements or responding to public questions, that's not a dialogue. That's really, it's not even taking action. So somebody brings an issue to your attention, what you can say is, your issue is best addressed by the CDO or by the director of HR. Please talk to that person. So you're responding to what they're bringing forward, but you're not engaging in actual action. You're just telling them how to get the answer they need. So this is a question that comes up a lot. What is a subsequent need item? There really are two important tests to qualify. You have to have a need for immediate action. In other words, it can't wait for your next meeting. You have to have a need for immediate action. That need has to have come to the board's attention after you posted the agenda. And the board has to amend your agenda at the meeting if everybody's present by a 2/3 vote. And if you don't have everybody present, by a unanimous vote of those who are here. Practice tip on that. If you're going to do a subsequent need item, I would recommend that you include the facts supporting the subsequent need in the minutes of the meeting, because 6 months later, odds are people will forget. So let's kind of move on with what does participation itself look like. And this is an important concept. The board meeting, the meeting is a meeting of the board, which the law requires you to do in public. It is not a meeting of the public to which you participate. And that's an important concept. If you've attended the Monterey County School Boards Association meetings, you've probably heard that at those trainings. This is really, it's an idea so you can get done the things that are on your meeting agenda within the time that you've allotted to get them done. So there are three ways that you address public participation. One is comment, one is the recording, and the other one is handling disruptions. As I was talking about in the earlier slides, you have to have a period where you allow the public to provide you input, to comment on items that are on your agenda. And if it's a regular meeting, you also have to allow that comment period on any matter which is within your subject matter jurisdiction, right? Most boards actually list that right on the agenda. Now, some places will actually ask that comment on particular agenda items.
But I can't take any requests right now. Please try again. It's a little while.
Some places will request that comments on particular items wait until that item is called, right? Other places don't do that. Other places will simply have one public comment period. Everybody comes up and says their piece at one time, and then the board does the rest of the meeting, and they don't take comment throughout the meeting. You can do it either way. The law does not specify how you have to do that. You just have to allow the comment period, right? There are advantages and disadvantages to both approaches. If you know you're going to have a really lengthy discussion on something, or like if you have to have a public hearing, for example, on a CEQA matter, then you might want to hold all that comment until the agenda item is called, because if you do it in the front of your meeting, right up at the beginning with general public comment, it might take 3 hours, and then everybody who's got the first few items has to wait for all that, and you can't get through it, and they can't go home. That's usually more critical with schools that have kids coming to the meetings, right? Especially towards the end of the year where you're doing awards and recognitions. But the point there is you can do it either way. The law does not specify how you have to do that. Also, on the time limits, the point of one of the, not only, but one of the big points of public comment is so that the board can make informed decisions. This is your opportunity to get information that you may want or need so that you can then exercise your voting prerogative with an informed mind. At some point, if it's going on for too long, at some point that information becomes less and less productive. There's declining marginal returns here. So the example of that is, how many times on a particular item do you need to have a person stand up and say, I don't support that, right? So that's why some school districts, cities, and so forth will impose maximum time limits. When they have the time limit reached, they will then survey the population out there and say, all right, everybody's heard what all the first 25 speakers have said. Who is in support of this? Hands go up. Who is not in support of this? Hands go up. It's legal to do that. You can also ask that if there's a camp on each side of an issue, you can ask that the camp nominate the person who's going to best advocate their position, that they go first, because they will oftentimes very articulately explain their side of the story, which then allows other people to come up and say in a very quick fashion, I heard what Mr. Garcia said, I agree with Mr. Garcia. And they don't have to try to say everything again.
I have a question.
Sure.
On the time limits, when you're having a translation, let's say we have our 3-minute time limit, and the translation, how does that affect their time speaking? Because, okay, then.
A lot of districts extend the time limit for translation.
Okay.
It really, I think, comes down to whether or not you have the ability to do the wireless, real-time, word-for-word translation or not. So, and that can be expensive. And so I've been in some districts where everybody who wants translation services has a headset, and the translator can just, as it's coming out of the person's mouth, it's in real-time Spanish. And then when the person speaking is speaking in Spanish, it's in real-time English. And that doesn't cause any delay at all because you have a headset, right? That's expensive. There aren't that many districts that do that. If you're not doing that, you can just add time.
Okay.
So the time limits are set by the board. The law doesn't set how long the time limits are. So a very common practice is 3 minutes. You've probably all heard that. Some districts do 1 minute. Some districts do 5 minutes, right? And in addition, they'll have maximum time limits, 20 or 30, whatever your policy says. And then the board controls, do you want to extend that or not? That's all a board decision.
Thank you.
An often overlooked avenue, by the way, is to accept comments in writing. On the translation issue in particular, sometimes people will feel far more comfortable submitting their comments to you in Spanish, written in Spanish, because they may be very fluent in that language. And then you can have those comments translated into English and you can read them. Okay, we've kind of covered this issue already. This is at regular meetings you have to have on comment period on any item on your agenda. Now, what are some strategies if you know you're going to have an issue that's going to take a lot of time, right? One of the things you can do, and I'll give you an example of where this can be very efficient, is you can appoint a subcommittee of board members to do a separate meeting schedule to meet with all the constituent groups, take the testimony, and then you come back to the full meeting, and you don't have to have any public comment at the full meeting at all. So the example of that is, if you're going to be changing, let's say, attendance boundaries, right? So you have, let's say, 11 schools, they all have attendance boundaries, and you're, in the bottom half of your district, you're going to be changing those due to changes in demographic attendance, right? Well, you could appoint a subcommittee of the board, let's say only 3 members. It would be a Brown Act committee, you'd have to publish an agenda for that, right? But you could have that committee be only the 3 that represent the affected areas, because you're a trustee area district. They could have meetings separate from your regular meeting schedule. And the only purpose of that meeting is to take the testimony, so you don't have to deal with other people waiting in line for their agenda items. And then they report back to the board at the next meeting where it's on the agenda. And because they've already heard all the testimony, you don't have to do it again. The law allows that. It's just a tool. Also, if you've already done a public comment period on an agenda item, and then you've carried that item over to another meeting, you don't have to redo it at the next meeting. There's no requirement that you actually rehear a comment twice. So there's 2 different issues that come up with responding to public comment, and they're very different depending upon whether or not that particular topic is on your agenda or not, right? If the item is on the agenda, then you can legally talk about it at the meeting because you've given notice to the world that you're going to be discussing that item. So typically, once the item's on the agenda, you have the comment period, then board members can have a full-throated discussion between themselves. You can ask staff for input. You can ask staff to address questions that came up during the public comment period. For protocol purposes, I think it's usually the best to have staff address the board when they're answering the questions because it's your meeting. And it also helps not to personalize sometimes on sensitive issues. I would recommend that you avoid getting into direct debates with members of the public because the law does not require you to open up either board members or staff to cross-examination. The board meeting is really your meeting for you to get the information you need and then make the decisions or not that you have before you. So public comment provides you with a bunch of questions, it provides you with a bunch of input, pro and con. Then if you don't like the answers you're getting from staff, your prerogative is either vote no or table it until the next meeting. Right? Now, if an item is not on the agenda, your hands are fairly tied at that point, because if it's not on the agenda, you're not supposed to engage in any substantive discussion regarding that item. That's a basic Brown Act requirement, because the world was not put on notice that you might be talking about it. So these 4 bullet points here are the things that the Attorney General's office has said you can do when you receive public comment on an item that's not on the agenda. But what you want to avoid is you want to avoid taking positions, starting to work towards any kind of a consensus on the issue, because it was not put on the agenda, the official notice wasn't put out. This issue actually comes up a lot. And the basic answer is no, you don't get to control public opinion. There's a case out of the federal court system, which I think is very instructive. And usually where this comes up is someone comes to your board meeting and they want to accuse an employee of something that's sensitive. They want to accuse a teacher of having inappropriate contact with their kid, or they're going to call a principal a child molester or something like that. And the district kind of feels an obligation to protect that employee's reputation, and so they want to tell the person, you can't say that at the meeting, right? Actually, they can, okay? So it doesn't mean that the affected individual is without a remedy. What it means is you don't get to be content specific in the control of the speech during the 3 minutes of comment. If they say something which is legally actionable as defamatory or slanderous statement, they might get sued by the person they're accusing, right? But what you don't want to do is violate their First Amendment rights to address you as an elected official during the comment period. Disruptions sometimes come up. Fortunately, they're not that common. The Brown Act specifically allows boards to remove individuals who are disrupting the meeting. There is no set protocol in the Brown Act for how you do that. So that is, again, a matter of local control. If you're removing people and you cannot ultimately restore order to a meeting, you can clear the entire room. That's a fairly extreme step. It is really rare, right? The practice tip, usually calling a 10-minute recess solves your problem. Oftentimes when disruptions are happening, it's because emotions are perking up, and the board can call a recess whenever you want. So if it's getting a little out of hand, the practice tip is you call a 10 or 15-minute recess, you leave the dais, and then you come back after there's been a chance for everybody to take a deep breath. Can meetings be recorded or broadcasted? Most important slide here for the young man in the middle. Right? The short answer is of course, because it's a public meeting. So if someone could record your meeting held in this county park, they could record your meeting held in this room. Right? The disruption rules still apply. So if you have a person who's disrupting the meeting and keeping you from getting work done because they're walking around the microphone and sticking it in the face of everybody there, or trying to interview them during the meeting, you don't have to allow that. Right? That almost never happens. It has happened, but it's not very common. Side note, if you record your own meetings, which some districts do, you're supposed to keep those for 30 days. If you have the media there or the radio there and they want to broadcast your meeting, they're allowed to do that. Generally, in my experience, the media are the easiest to work with. They know they can't disrupt the meeting and they just want to be able to get access to you. 90% of the time, they want to be located where the power is, right? So if you know the media is going to be present, sometimes they'll call you ahead of time, right? You might want to have your maintenance or tech support put a power strip to the side so that they can set up not in front of everybody, right? What are you required to do for minutes? This is another question that comes up. So now you've had your meeting, the meeting's over, and somebody's preparing the minutes. What do they have to say? This actually comes out of the Education Code, not the Brown Act. And the Education Code just sets a basic requirement that you have to disclose the times that you met from here to there and what actions you took. That's it, right? There is no requirement that minutes be a verbatim record of what was said. And there's no requirement that you have a stenographer present or that you maintain recordings indefinitely. As I mentioned on the last slide, it's a 30-day timeline. A lot of districts will go above and beyond the basic legal requirement, and they will include in the minutes very brief summaries of who said what. And if it's going too quickly, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll record a head count of 25 people opposed, 35 people again, in support, right? But really, all the legal requirement is what happened at the meeting in terms of the board's action, and that's the official record of what you did. Documents. This is a piece that actually is getting a little more confusing. The law is putting more requirements on this in the last few years. So if you have a document that's for a board meeting and it goes out with the agenda packet to the board, at the same time it goes out with the agenda packet to the board, it should be publicly available because it's ready, it's done. If you have a document that's not ready, your meeting's coming up, but it's not done 72 hours in advance and somebody's still trying to get it finished, right? Then they added this specificity of the Brown Act that says at the time you give it to a majority of the board, you now have to make it publicly available, right? Most districts do that on their website, but you also are supposed to have a district place where people can come get them, because again, not everybody has internet access. Also, as a practice tip, I would recommend that if you have documents that are late prepared, they were not ready with the packet, It's usually a good practice to have a little stack of them and you put them on a table in the back, because that way people who come to the meeting and they get interested in it at the meeting, they can just walk back, grab one, and they have it. Closed session materials are different. And this is where we're going to segue a little bit into the Public Records Act. Documents or writings or communications that are distributed for closed session are exempt from disclosure under the Brown Act, unless they would qualify as a public record under the Public Records Act. So a little bit more on the Public Records Act. This is sort of the sibling to the Brown Act. It is a transparency statute, an open government statute. And the idea is, the basic default is that a document is public unless it meets an exception. It's very similar to the Brown Act. The default is you do it in open session unless there's an exception that allows you to do it in closed. Same concept for the Public Records Act. I gave a workbook or a reference guide to your superintendent earlier, which was published by the League of California Cities. It's a very good reference guide. They spent a lot of time putting that together. And it answers probably 80% of the questions that come up on the Public Records Act. So if you use that fairly religiously, it'll save you a significant amount of money. Right? The exceptions in the Public Records Act are designed to balance the public's right to know against an individual's right to privacy. And that's the basic trade-off that's going on. Also, sometimes the organization itself has an institutional need for confidentiality. Some examples of that are, if you're going to be, well, for biggest example for school districts usually is, if you're going to be meeting with a bargaining representative, either for a real estate transaction or for collective bargaining vis-a-vis your unions, if you have that discussion in open session, you don't have a strategy anymore, right? You need to have that bargaining strategy discussion in closed session in order for it to be effective. So that's not an individual privacy concern, it's an organizational concern, but it's equally valid. Also, under the Public Records Act, and I would mention that a lot of times people make reference to FOIA, or the Federal Freedom of Information Act. That does not apply to you as a school district. So your obligations are under California state law, which is the Public Records Act, in the Government Code.
I have a question. What about personnel issues?
So personnel issues are one of the exceptions that allows you to go into closed session for public employee appointment, dismissal, release, contemplation of discipline, short of dismissal, such as a demotion or suspension, things like that. All of that can be done in closed session. There's a general personnel exception for when you're thinking about, do I want to take this person and give them that job? Right? That is generally a individual privacy right, because much of personnel files is statutorily confidential. And so you don't want to have a situation where the organization has to expose itself to liability in open session by disclosing statutorily confidential information. So the Brown Act allows you to have a closed session discussion on personnel matters. And most districts, by far the majority, do that. Because if you do it in open session, what you only get to do is have 10% of the conversation. The rest is confidential. You can't talk about it. And then the people watching the conversation, it doesn't make any sense to them because they don't understand why you're doing what you're doing.